Hi everyone, thanks for coming to hear this. I'm Jane and there's some familiar faces here, but most of you are new to me. I haven't met you before, so just so I can kind of gauge who everyone is. Who's currently like a student of games? Lots of students, that's great. Who's working on indie stuff? Yep, great. Working for a larger studio? Anyone? Awesome. And people here not involved in games at all, just interested people. Awesome. Great. A little bit of everything, mostly students. That's great. So I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about the field of game design that I'm working in, which is the intersection of psychology and designing games. But it'll mostly be about psychology because that's my background. So I am Jane Cox and I have been a psychology researcher for about 10 years. I've got a Bachelor of Behavioural Science and a Bachelor of Health Science, psychology honours. I didn't do any consulting or working with people in a therapeutic context, it was all just research. And then I really started to get interested in games and game design and how much games can impact us emotionally. And I thought that might be a really good way to, I guess, add on to therapy and also just help people change their motivations or their thoughts or their feelings. Because I've grown up playing games, as probably many of you have, and we realise that we love them and that they're actually quite powerful when we design them for a particular purpose. So I'm currently doing a PhD in building a framework which takes from psychology, and it's a framework for designing games specifically for behaviour change and all the different other psychological ingredients before behaviour change. So that's me. So I'm going to just talk about three things tonight. Firstly, just a couple of useful psych concepts that you might be able to think about or apply in when you're designing games or when you're thinking about games. I'll go over a couple of game case studies of things that are interesting and topical at the moment. And then I'll talk about my game design wheel, which this is very much a work in progress. I haven't finished my PhD yet, still 6 months to go. So therefore 90% of the work still to go. So they're the three things that I'll talk about. So firstly, just some useful psychology concepts. So this first one, there's been quite a lot of research done lately, certainly in the last few years, about games are good for you and why are games good for you. This is one of the theories of why games are good for you. It's because they meet all of our internal psychological needs. So PERMA is a framework of flourishing. And when we are flourishing, we're basically ticking the boxes of all these ingredients in our life. So the P is for positive emotion, engagement, E, engagement in activity, relationships, meaning and accomplishment. So when we're actually meeting all of those criteria in our life, that actually provides for a much more flourishing and a much more content self. And there's a theory that video games are actually really great at doing all of these things, and that's why we really, really like them. So when you're actually designing games, there's lots of different things that you can design for, and these five should definitely be within those five things. So the second psych concept that I'd like to talk about is soup, and just talk a little bit about human nature and behaviour and our functioning. So let's say that you want to create an intervention or something for people to think about something differently or change the way that they're feeling or change the way that they're doing a behaviour. You can't just look at the behaviour itself and try and layer on things on top of the behaviour to change it. You actually have to take a step back and look at all the ingredients. So just like there's all different non-soup-like ingredients that go into soup, and we cut them up and we cook them and then it all turns into soup, that's what, humans are like. We're a collection of all different things. We're a collection of feelings. Top right corner is thoughts. The light bulb is motivation. We all have different motivations. DNA. We all have different genetic structures that create how we behave and ultimately function as humans, different attitudes. And we have different schemas, different ways of looking at the world, different ways of thinking and feeling. So that's a really fundamental concept, that if you're trying to create a game which impacts on any one of those things, then you need to take a step back and look at all the ingredients that you're working with. So it's not just about changing behaviour, it might be about tweaking motivation or changing an attitude. And that leads on into the heavy theory stuff, which is social cognitive theory. And that is basically a theory explaining how everything interacts and how we end up behaving. So we're all sitting on this big wheel. There's lots of different environmental factors, and to have a look at behaviour, all of these things need to take place before we get behaviour. We need to have a thought first, and then that thought gives us a particular feeling. And then that particular feeling, based on all our environmental and previous experiences, will give us a particular behaviour. So if you're looking to create something, a game, an intervention, anything in life which is looking at changing behaviour, then you need to rewind and go back to the thoughts and the feelings. And so this is kind of informing some of the design that I'm working with. In terms of, if you look at games for change at the moment, a lot of them are based on gamification type models, whereby there's behaviour that's incentivised by rewards. So this is a psychological conditioning approach. And what it does is it's really just looking at behaviour. And so you can have in-game rewards and in-game incentives to do a particular thing, which might just be behaviour within a game. But if you're trying to create a behaviour outside of the game, especially one that lasts longer, then you need to step back and you need to have a look at thoughts and feelings as well and change those, because those are actually fundamental to how we behave going forward. Really dry throat. Where's my water? Okay, so now I'll just talk about a couple of game case studies. So like I mentioned before, there's like this first wave of games for change is kind of based on gamification type principles. So what I'm working towards is something that might be like the second wave of games for change, which is having a look at more of those fundamental human functioning, components. So we'll look at this one first. Games as changes. So you've probably heard of Lumosity. It's a brain cognitive trainer, particularly marketed towards older people. Play Lumosity and you won't get dementia. That's not accurate, by the way. Their marketing is very overstated. So Lumosity is a cognitive training program which is supposed to enhance your problem solving, your spatial skills, your persistence, and it was designed specifically to do that, but actually Portal 2 is more effective. So this is a study that was done just a few years ago, and it's really remarkable. It's actually a great argument for what games actually are and how they actually work and function in our minds and what they train, what kinds of behaviours they train. So yeah, Portal 2 is a lot more effective than Lumosity at what Lumosity tries to do. So why is that? It's because you're giving people the experience of practicing those skills. They're actually having to actively figure out problems so that they can get through the game. And it's motivating because it's Portal. It's a great story. Think, Feel, Do. It's based on CBT. And it's literally just a digital version of CBT that's providing therapy, and it does help people improve because it's a digital game and they're probably more fun. So people engage with it, but it's really just a replica of a real world thing. Sparks is also very similar. in that you have to defeat these things called NATs, and they are literally negative automatic thoughts, which is what we need to defeat when we're combating things like anxiety in the real world. We have negative automatic thoughts and we have to challenge them as they arise, which is exactly what you do in the game. So it is successful as well, but it's literally just a digital translation of what's going on in the outside world. So the second case study that I'll talk about is this one. It's 7 Doors. It's not a full game. This was just a demo that we made at the Games for Change conference in New York recently, called 7 Doors. It's based on a psychological therapy, but instead of didactically teaching the actual therapy components, it gets you to experience what the behaviour is like in that skill. So it models the accepts model of distress tolerance, and it helps you to regulate your emotions when you're in high levels of distress. So there's that one. And again, the point is that it's getting people to experience the kind of things that you want them to rehearse in the game, and then they translate that to outside of the game. The third one that I'll talk about is Nevermind, and I love talking about this example because it's so unexpected. This is a relaxation game. It doesn't look relaxing, but it's really effective. It's a biofeedback game, which is when you are feeling anxious and your blood, your pulse, your heart rate, that's the one, rises. It actually detects that. You're either wearing a biofeedback headset, or you can wear an Apple Watch or something like that. It can detect your heart rate. Other hardware that you can use can detect your sweat, can detect, blood pressure, all of these kinds of things. And as you are exposed throughout the game to increasing levels of difficulty and challenge and so kind of scary stimulus, you actually get everything rises and you're starting to become anxious. And the game gets harder. The game knows that, and it gets harder. So the only way to get through the game is to relax, to train yourself to relax and to notice. It's a skill called interoceptive awareness. So, and most of us are quite bad at it until we're at the peak. So if you imagine our levels of arousal go from completely relaxed and calm, or say even asleep, right up to the top where you're peaking out, might be a panic attack or something like that, and then you come back down. So most of us are pretty bad at interoceptive awareness, which is recognising your physiological states, until we're kind of peaking out and we're really anxious. So what this does is it gets you to pay attention and develop that muscle of interoceptive awareness, so that you become aware of your internal states and start, practicing your breathing and relaxing, just sitting for a second, and then you can continue with the game, knowing that you're not actually on your way to peaking out. And that's been really effective for developing what's called emotional regulation, which is a skill which is based on that physiological skill of interoceptive awareness. And I'm up to number 3 already. So this is my PhD research. I'm designing a framework for behaviour change for game designers. So it's basically bringing psychology to game designers so that they can design games for emotional, motivational, attitude, finally behaviour change, because that's the cycle. And I will go into some background theory before I show you the framework as it currently is. Here's a lovely quote from Brenda Romero, who's one of the world's greatest game designers, in my opinion, of course. So games can change us. They affect us emotionally. Art affects us emotionally. Music, literature. So games are a way to do this really, really effectively. And arguably even more so than other art mediums, because they're interactive. So this research is a synthesis of 3 different fields. Psychology, so how do we understand and change human behaviour? And I've talked a little bit about that already. We're looking at models such as self-determination theory, cognitive behavioural theory, which that's the thoughts, feelings, behaviour, gears that I showed, and the transtheoretical model of behaviour change. I'll talk more about that in a second. Ludology, which is game design, so how do we design games for immersion? A lot of you would be learning about that now. And the particular framework that I'm adopting in my research is mechanics, dynamics and aesthetics. What are the things that we need to think of in each of those 3 categories in order to design games for emotional impact and immersion? And the 3rd field is narratology. How do we design narratives for emotional impact? How do we persuade people with stories? What is important about the characters and the story within the game. So they're the 3 components. Here's the transtheoretical model of behaviour change, which basically suggests that all of our behaviour, if we want to change our behaviour, we need to go through these 5 stages of change. So it all starts with pre-contemplation. So you're thinking about changing a particular behaviour. Let's say you want to exercise more. Yep, I'm going to exercise more. I'm definitely going to do that next week. You're not ready to do that right now. You're thinking about it, but you're not ready to make any kind of commitments. It's a thing that's out there. It would be good. Might do it. Probably won't. So that's pre-contemplation. And I'll get to the dot points below these stages in a second. Contemplation is when you're actively contemplating about it. You know that you're going to do it. You're not quite ready. Maybe you need some gear to do the change. Maybe you need to resolve some issues in order to do this change. Preparation is actively preparing for it. Action stage is you're making the change. It's happening right now. You're on your bike, you're going for that bike ride, you're getting fit. Maintenance is the continuation of that change over a course of 6 months. So this is all really important to know because you'll see that most of the work happens before any behaviours are actually changed at all. So when we're thinking about making games for change, gamification type methods, they start at the green arrow. They activate behaviours straight away and activate those rewards. But in the long term, that actually doesn't change a lot. It develops a habit which may or may not stick because you haven't thought about it. You haven't changed your attitude, you haven't changed your motivation, you haven't changed how you feel about it. So really important to know if you want to create those games for change. So these individual dot points are the psychological processes that we go through in order to move from one stage of change to the next. So the first one is consciousness raising, and that's all about giving information to people. So you want to raise their consciousness about, let's keep using the keep fit example. You want to raise their awareness of the issues. You want to tell them how much more energy they'll have if they start exercising, how much better sleep they'll get, how better it is for your body, speed up metabolism, all of these different things associated with the positive change. Dramatic relief is the critical one, and I believe it's where games can make an enormous difference. Dramatic relief is the emotional moment. It's the aha moment when you realise, shit, I've got to make that change. Games are really great at giving us emotive, impactful moments. Environmental reevaluation is when you're looking around you and figuring out what has to change around you and in your environmental contexts in order to change. Contemplation is all about self-reevaluation. What is it that you need to change in order to achieve that behaviour change? Preparation is self-liberation. You're liberating yourself from old habits. You're figuring out what is going to support the behaviour that you're going to change next. And then action is all about surrounding yourself by people who will help you make that change. Counter conditioning, don't do the old behaviour, do the new one and make that rewarding for yourself. Stimulus control is very similar. Don't put yourself in the way of a prompt to do the old behaviour. Put yourself in the way of a prompt that makes you do the new behaviour. And that's reinforcement management as well. So some of these concepts are very similar to gamification type concepts. They're all about management of rewards and incentivising a particular behaviour, but you've already done all of the psychological work before you get to that point. And then maintenance is all about social liberation and just reinforcing that ongoing change. The second thing that I'll talk about is narrative immersion and the importance of building around stories into impactful games. Because it's not all mechanical. You can't do this all with mechanics. You need to actually change the way that people are thinking and get them to adopt new perspectives. So this is where games are excellent, because we can get people to take on roles that they don't otherwise have the opportunity to in real life. It's the same as when you're reading a really good story. Have you ever read a book and you just know the characters, and even in situations that you haven't read about in the story, you know how that character would behave in a different situation. So that's role taking. You're actually taking on that role, not you as that person, but you can see what they would adopt. So that's really good character development. Defamiliarisation with their current context and immersion into the story is really important for empathy building. And this is where really great representation is so important, because we want people to defamiliarise with their current contexts and familiarise with the characters and the contexts in the story. So we need to make them representative enough and familiar enough to them so that they can adopt those points of view. But at the same time, it's just slightly different, and they can build empathy with a different kind of character that's like them. If that makes sense. Transportation is the third one, and that is involved in when you are doing the role taking. You can imagine this character. You've defamiliarised with your context and you're experiencing that different story. You're transported into that story world, and that's how we persuade people with different stories. We can see different ways of behaving and different ways of thinking and feeling. And this is an example of, this is the game design for behaviour change wheel that I'm working on. It's not yet finished, but effectively what it is the stages of change that I talked about. We start here and we go all the way around from pre-contemplation about a particular problem to contemplating it, preparing, action, and then maintaining that habit for a long time, or that behaviour. And these are all, the second wheel is the psychological processes that we need to go through in order to make a successful long-term change. And then the third wheel, which is something that I'm working on at the moment by interviewing lots of game designers for impact games, is what are the game design theories, tools, techniques? What are the game design mechanics, dynamics and aesthetics that we can use to prompt these individual specific psychological processes? So it's obviously a work in progress, but let's say you want to change someone's attitude about something. Your work is going to be creating a game in this quadrant over here. So you're going to be looking at giving them information about what it is. You're going to be looking at giving them emotional experiences within that game world, and then prompting them to think about the contexts that they're in and the contexts within themselves as well. Let's say you want to change someone's attitude and motivation, and get them to think and feel differently about something. Then your work might be all through this area here. It doesn't necessarily have to be a behaviour change that you go for. It just matters what your intent is when you're actually creating a game as to which sections you're going to look at. If you want to create a game that'll change a specific behaviour, then you'll need to go through the whole thing. And So that's the behaviour change game design wheel, and that is it. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions at all? Yes.
Just jumping straight off the wheel that you showed us, you said you were still working on it, but is that available anywhere, perhaps on the Game Plus page?
It's available directly from me by email. Yeah, no, it is. I'm very happy to email it to anyone that wants to have a look. It's not in a published form yet. It's literally just this image. Yeah, so it'll be, I'm working on this wheel. I'm integrating a practice-led approach into it. That'll be the third wheel, and the third wheel is going to be quite substantial because, as you can imagine, there's a lot of game design work that's involved in dramatic relief, and there's a lot involved in consciousness raising. There's a lot that we can do to create a consciousness raising game. So yeah, so it'll be finished by the end of the year because I have to hand it up early next year. So. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah. So thinking of the portal example you gave.
Yes.
Portal versus think, feel, do, or whatever.
Yes.
Is it true that games work a lot of the time in changing behaviour because you're kind of flying under the radar? You engage the conscious mind of the player with some tasks they're meant to do, like
Exactly.
sci-fi place and you've got to create cortex and so on.
Yep.
But then there's like a message underneath that that you sort of slipping into them, whereas if you just present them with a blunt message,
Mhm.
it doesn't work the same way.
Exactly. So that's a really, really important point. And you're talking about the difference in didactic teaching methods and experiential teaching methods. So if you want to teach someone a thing, the traditional way of doing that is didactically. You just give them the information. Experientially is getting them to experience and do it, to go through the process of do it. We're a lot more effective at learning and thinking and changing when through experiential learning. So that's how Portal is more effective, because they want to play the game, so therefore they have to problem solve actively.
And that'd be the same with the relaxation horror game.
Exactly.
You just tell someone, right, relax.
Yes. Like, here's some information about how to do relaxation.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Yeah, whereas if the conscious mind's sort of engaged in, right, I've got to get through this hot scenario and make the faces go away.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and so there's this one scene in Nevermind where the room starts filling up with milk and you have to try and relax and bring down the milk level. It's in the kitchen and you're a child and you know, that's the horror scenario for the child, is you're going to drown in milk in your kitchen. Which, that's reasonable. I mean, that sounds terrible to me. But yeah, you have to relax. You have to develop the interoceptive awareness. When the milk level starts bubbling and rising, that's when you can feel your anxiety going up. You can do something about it at that point. Yes.
I was wondering, you sort of mentioned there was that firma at the beginning, and
Yes.
you mentioned one of them was like achievement or something,
Mm-hmm.
which I think in games would be solving the puzzle, actually doing something active to, you know, engage with it. But then you also talk about narrative and aesthetics.
Yep.
Is there a conflict between like interactive experiences which are open-ended and narratives and aesthetics which are sort of, you know, telling a story that get us more emotionally engaged? So is there a sort of a conflict between those two things in a way?
A conflict between the narrative and what's the second one?
Being more sort of interactive, open, and problem solving,
Mm-hmm.
you know, rather than a linear narrative which actually might engage us emotionally because it's someone's story.
Yeah, look, that's a good question. I don't think there's a conflict there. I think it's a balance. Like, these are all different sliders, you know, like in the example that I gave before, the Nevermind, there's not much positive emotion going on there. It's a horror game, but it's not designed for that. It's designed for a particular skill to be developed. So there's not necessarily a conflict between one and the other. I just think it's creating experiences which this is a good kind of starting position if you want to create a game for change. But if really what you're doing is you want to enhance someone's motivation and resilience and, then maybe you might focus your game design on accomplishment, like the last one. Give them multiple repeated opportunities for success, because then they'll be, really maxing out on that accomplishment. Yes?
So Samantha in the chat wants to know if you have any good recommendations for learning more about sort of the psychology and how it could possibly relate to games, or maybe just the psychology part, like the sort of, someone who's as education as yourself on the topic to sort of get a grasp of sort of what you're talking
So kind of like good psychology grounders.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
That's a great question. I haven't prepared an answer for that one. Can I take that away and tweet out a couple of
Yeah, for sure.
books or texts later, and I'll link to them. Yeah, great. Yes.
How would a game focus on the relationships part of the
Co-op, multiplayer, maybe. It doesn't even have to be. It might be a game about relationships, but thinking about the ways in which you engage in relationships. Like, Ken's Florence is a beautiful example of that, of how we can create games which help you to deeply introspect about relationships.
That was what I was actually thinking. I was just playing it before, and there was not much of the A in that. Like, there wasn't a real sense of solving it. It was just you did something to sort of get through to the next stage. But the story was beautiful and the aesthetics were beautiful. So.
That's right. And so depending on the goal, you might go, lighter or heavier on these elements. Yes. Yep.
So this all sounds really good, but are there ethical considerations that we as designers should keep in mind regarding this? So
Absolutely.
if there's like a good thing we can do with it, that means we can screw it up and do it poorly. Yeah?
Very much so. Yes. And that's a great question. I'm currently writing guidelines for that, actually, ethical design. It's for a VR contexts, but there's a lot of important things to consider with exposure. So exposure to particular stimuli. One of the really powerful ways of treating and addressing trauma or difficulties and things like that is by exposure therapy. And it takes a very skilled therapist or psychologist or psychiatrist to actually introduce that gradually enough and appropriately to a person. So, you want to make a game that's going to start tackling trauma and PTSD and things like that. Don't do it unless you speak to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. There's very important things to consider there. So yeah, it's an ethical minefield, and all these things need to be considered carefully. Yes. So what kinds of effects? Has more of an effect in what way?
What you're trying to do, behaviour change, you're trying to, this whole process speed up if the game is faster.
Yeah, look, that's a good question. I think game pacing and kind of arousal levels need to be taken into account when you're designing experiences around particularly that dramatic relief psychological process, because fast-paced, confronting type experiences are very good at creating dramatic relief for people. I'm not sure that you're going to go through all of those psychological processes in a fast-paced shooter, and you come out the other end riding your bicycle every day. Like, that's not how it works. But Yeah, I think that's a valid question. And yeah, you need to think about what the objective is with the particular psychological process that you're looking to design for. So it's an option. Yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned the games for change a few times.
Yes.
So you had capitalised the theme which I was referring to that.
Yep.
And that can cover games where you're trying to change your own behaviour.
Mhm.
Does it also cover games where you're trying to change other people's behaviour? You know, let's say making a political game.
Mhm.
Does that fall under the same umbrella?
Yeah. Yeah, it would. It would, because and there's been quite a few of these lately, particularly over in the US, where what you're actually trying to achieve with those types of games is a change of attitude and an insight into different attitudes and the value of those attitudes. So yes, it definitely is about those kinds of games as well. But it also could be, like I'll talk about games for change, but it could also be just you actually want your game to make a particular statement. And it's not necessarily about creating change. It may be you just want to deliver a game that's just about that dramatic relief element to say, this is a thing, look at it.
Because the one I had in mind when I was thinking about that was a game where you run a private prison.
Yeah.
There's no sense of moral censure in the game. Just you end up making decisions to save money. You lock the prison up for 23 hours a day, whatever. I guess everyone is playing it, so that's this cold moment at some point where it's like, oh my god, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And the game is made to make a political point.
Yes.
Private prison system.
Yeah.
Humane.
Yes.
So that would sort of fall under this kind of pattern here.
Yeah, and so one of the things that's important is that's great. You can make games to make a point. You can make games to make no point whatsoever, just for fun. But what I'm working on is those games that you want to make a particular point up round to changing some aspect of the way we think, feel or do. But yeah, making the games which just make a point, people need to know that they don't do the whole spectrum. They don't go around the whole wheel. They're not actually going to change people's behaviour in all likelihood. They're just statement pieces. Yeah. Is that it? Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So that would be a great question for like a particular game that you wanted to address a behaviour change, and so you go through that pre-contemplation stage and all the way around to behaviour change. The really important thing with changing behaviours is the rehearsal, is the maintenance phase. And so if you wanted to create a game for, let's say running, Zombies Run is a good example of that, in that it's a mobile game which releases new seasons, and so it's a pay for it's a service game. So that's the kind of thing that you might consider if you want to create a game for just ongoing change. But yeah, if you want to create a game just for a change of attitude, or increasing motivation around a particular issue, then it might not be that. It might be more like a single experience statement type game. Is that it? Cool. Well, thank you all. I'll just put my bits on the end. Feel free to tweet at me. I live on Twitter, not in the real world, and that's my email address, and I'd be delighted to speak to any of you. So thank you very much.